Hello everyone, and welcome back to Americanism Zoomer. Today's topic is on indentured servants in America. In public school, you will learn a few basic facts about indentured servants and how it compares to slavery before quickly moving on to the road to the revolution, and then after the revolution you will hear a lot about slavery, but you will not hear any more about the indentured servants. I wanted to quickly dispel 3 myths about indentured servants, specifically how the institution compares with slavery. Let's go ahead and get started with myth number 1. Indentured servants had the freedom of choice to become indentured servants. As always with historical data, it is difficult to give precise numbers, especially when dealing with the lower classes of society, but I will give some broad estimates on numbers here that are historically safe to use. During the colonial period of America, around 300,000 indentured servants came of their own free will. Especially in the first 50 years of the Virginia colony, free will is a loose term to use because traveling to America as a servant was an act of desperation for all of these people. They were in search for a better life and were willing to sacrifice their best years for a chance of becoming a landowner. After the first couple of years at Jamestown, England was well aware that the survival rates of the Virginia Company colony were extremely low, yet these free willers signed up to go anyway for a chance to get out of their perpetual poverty back on their home island. Outside of these free willer indentured servants, there were still tens of thousands of other indentured servants that found their way in perpetual bondage without willingly signing up. These are the forgotten white slaves of America. Now on YouTube, I tried finding if anyone else had made a video about these white slaves, and it seems there are a lot of videos on the Irish slaves. These come from the time period of Oliver Cromwell and his war with Ireland. After winning the war, he subjugated thousands of soldiers and those who were not adjusting to the English rule to bondage in the Americas. However, if you want more details, there's plenty of well-made content already on YouTube. But what about the other tens of thousands of white slaves still not accounted for? The rest of the white slaves were forced to America in 3 different ways. Number 1. These are the orphaned street urchins of London and the other large English cities. Some leaders in government saw the need for labor in Virginia as a prime opportunity to send the unwanted citizens out of their cities. This is a large reason why the average age for indentured servants was so low. These children were arrested for petty crimes and then sent across the ocean. It was a mutual deal between the government and the Virginia Company. Both parties filled a need. Tragically, extremely few of these street urchins would ever become a landowner after their indentured slavery had finished due to their young age, the sea travel, and the hard life on the tobacco plantations, and exorbitant amounts of these children and young adults will die before they serve their required 7 years. Number 2. The next way white slaves were forced to America is very similar, but it is just the emptying of British prisoners. Now, it is very interesting that Australia still has the reputation of being a penal colony for the unwanted British, and it is a meme in the global mind towards the identity of the Aussies. That and everything there being upside down. However, Australia opened up for this use in the 1780s, the same decade America won its independence. The reason the British had to open up Australia is because America was now refusing these prisoners, and they now needed a new place to send them. Also, many of these prisoners were religious and political dissenters from Scotland because they disagreed with the Church of England. Number 3. The final way white slaves made it to America was by way of kidnapping. Unlike the street urchins of London, these kidnappings had zero legitimacy to them. Often run by shady merchants at port cities or corrupt city officials, children would be sold in an underground slave trade. Some of these children eventually made their way back to their homelands, like the famous story of James Ainsley, who went back to denounce their kidnappers and tried to reclaim their previous lost life. As stated earlier, it is hard to give precise numbers, but the number combining all of these white slaves disguised as indentured servants would be nearing or surpassing 100,000 people. On to myth number 2. Indentured servants were not as economically useful as slaves because servants would only serve for 4 to 10 years. Now, this argument will hold a little bit more merit during the Revolutionary era, whenever indentured servitude was going out of style and being replaced by slavery. But early on, this was definitely not true. The reason is because of something called the headright system. This was an incentive-based system where for every servant that got paid passage to America, the person that paid the passage would receive 50 acres of land for free. Now, there are a couple things to break down here. First is that for the price of one boat ride, which is estimated to be about a year's wages for a commoner, the master of that servant would receive around 7 years of labor and 50 acres. This is a very economically sound deal. Now, on paper, it is because those 50 acres would go to the servants once they completed their term. However, it is only estimated that about 1 in 10 servants ever became landowners, meaning the planters often got to keep around 80 to 90% of their free head rights, growing their own wealth. It is from this head right system that Jefferson, Madison, Washington, and Lee's ancestors will start their generational aristocratic wealth that leads them to prominence and power in America. Also, the head right system led to a bit of a corrupt pyramid scheme in some places where merchants would pay for the servants' journey to America to collect and sell the head rights, and then the servants would just be sold on an auction block when they arrived because a specific planter had not already bought them. This is why kidnapping was such a reality, because corrupt merchants could collect so much more than just the price of a slave. Now on to our third and final myth. Indentured servants were treated better than slaves because indentured servants were white. Once again, this myth may carry a little more merit in the years as indentured servitude was ending, but for every story that makes you uncomfortable about slavery, you can find a story even more cruel from the 1600s servitude institution. There is more evidence that indentured servants were treated worse than slaves than the other way around. Now, if you find that hard to believe, the logic behind it is very simple. Once slavery became a legal institution in the Americas, it meant you would own the slave for life. In order to get as much use out of that slave, you need to treat the slave humanely so that they are healthy and survive many years. That is the best way to profit from slavery. However, with indentured servitude, you only have them for around 7 years, meaning planters would work them as hard as possible for 7 years and give them very little necessities to survive. Servants also had 0 rights while they were a servant, meaning they could not do things like get married or go off the property without the master's permission. Servants were beaten with whips, and sometimes they would be accused of false misconduct in order to extend their servitude. Just to give a primary source example to prove this point, one of the worst places to be a servant in the Americas was the island of Barbados. The author, Richard Ligon, wrote about what he witnessed on this island. The island is divided into 3 sorts of men: masters, servants, and slaves. The slaves and their posterity, being subject to their masters forever, are kept and preserved with greater care than the servants, who are theirs but for 5 years, according to the law of the island. So that for that time, the servants have the worst lives, and they are put to very hard labor, ill lodging, and their diet very slight. He also writes, "If they be not strong men, this ill lodging will put them into a sickness. If they complain, they are beaten by the overseer. If they resist, their time is doubled. I have seen an overseer beat a servant with a cane about the head until the blood has followed, for a fault that was not even worth the speaking of. And yet he must have patience, or worse will follow. Truly, I have seen such cruelties there done to servants as I did not think one Christian would have ever done to another." So that is it for the 3 myths of indentured servitude. All of my information from this video comes from the book White Cargo by Don Jordan and Michael Walsh. I highly recommend it if you would like to learn more about this topic, or if you did not particularly believe a certain point that I brought up. Thank you all for watching this video. I hope you learned something about the forgotten white slaves of America, and I will catch you next time.